They ordered her to strip her uniform in front of hundreds of soldiers, calling her a disgrace to the military. But when they saw the tattoo on her back, an admiral immediately stepped forward and saluted. What happened next would change everything. At Norfolk Naval Base forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Natasha Brooks stood at the edge of the Norfolk Naval Base training yard, watching fresh recruits struggle through exercises that once would have been second nature to her. At 32 years old, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed oddly out of place among the shouting drill sergeants and eager young sailors. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, though she wore civilian clothes, now a simple navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants that marked her as a contractor rather than active military personnel. The morning, Virginia's sun cast long shadows across the concrete training ground as Natasha observed the chaos unfolding before her. New recruits stumbled through obstacle courses, their faces red with exertion and frustration. Instructors barked corrections that echoed off the nearby buildings. Everything about this place should have felt familiar to her, but instead, it felt like watching a movie of someone else's life. For the past 6 weeks, Natasha had been working as a civilian training consultant, brought in to evaluate and improve the physical fitness programs at Norfolk. Her credentials on paper were impressive enough: advanced degrees in exercise physiology and military science, certifications from multiple fitness organizations, and glowing recommendations from her previous consulting jobs. What those papers didn't mention was the decade she'd spent as an active-duty Navy SEAL, or the classified missions that had taken her to corners of the world most people couldn't find on a map. The other staff members at Norfolk had made their opinions about her clear from day one. To them, she was just another desk jockey, a civilian who'd never faced real military challenges, trying to tell actual service members how to do their jobs. They saw her small frame, barely 5'4" and 125 pounds, and her quiet demeanor, and they assumed she was soft. They couldn't have been more wrong. Sergeant Olivia Grant was the first to make her displeasure known. Grant was everything Natasha wasn't: tall, loud, and constantly asserting her authority over anyone within earshot. With 15 years of Navy experience and biceps that strained the sleeves of her uniform, Grant commanded respect through intimidation and volume. She'd taken one look at Natasha on her first day and immediately decided that this civilian consultant was a threat to her authority. "Look at this," Grant had muttered to her colleagues during Natasha's first week, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They're bringing in civilians to tell us how to train sailors. What's next? Asking kindergarten teachers to plan combat operations." The comment had drawn laughter from the group of instructors gathered around the coffee station. Natasha, who was reviewing training schedules at a nearby table, had simply continued working as if she hadn't heard anything. Her lack of reaction seemed to frustrate Grant even more. Corporal Ethan Walsh, a stocky man in his late 20s, with the kind of swagger that comes from being the biggest fish in a small pond, had quickly become Grant's most enthusiastic supporter in the campaign against Natasha. Walsh had spent 8 years in the Navy, most of it in shore-based positions, but he carried himself like a combat veteran. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his opinions delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. "I don't get it," Walsh had said during a particularly vocal lunch conversation. "We've got real military personnel here who've dedicated their lives to service, and they bring in some civilian consultant who probably learned everything she knows from YouTube videos." Lieutenant Zoe Palmer, fresh out of officer training and eager to fit in with the more experienced personnel, had initially tried to give Natasha the benefit of the doubt. But as the weeks passed and the negative comments continued, Palmer found herself swept along with the prevailing opinion. It was easier to join the crowd than to stand up for someone she barely knew. The truth was, nobody at Norfolk knew who Natasha really was. Her military records were classified at levels that required clearances none of the base personnel possessed. As far as they could tell from her personnel file, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a civilian contractor with academic credentials, but no real military experience. Natasha had grown accustomed to being underestimated. During her active duty years, she'd learned that being underestimated could be an advantage. Enemies who thought she was weak made mistakes. Allies who doubted her capabilities were often pleasantly surprised. She'd built a career on exceeding expectations that had been set deliberately low, but this situation was different. She wasn't operating behind enemy lines where every mistake could be fatal. She was trying to do a job that required cooperation from people who had already decided she wasn't worth their respect. Every suggestion she made was met with skepticism. Every improvement she proposed was dismissed as theoretical nonsense from someone who'd never faced real military challenges. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, completing missions that would never be acknowledged publicly, working with teams where trust and competence were matters of life and death. Now she was struggling to get a group of peacetime sailors to take her fitness recommendations seriously. Captain Lucas Reed had been watching the dynamic unfold with growing irritation. Reed was a career officer who'd risen through the ranks by maintaining discipline and order. He prided himself on running a tight ship, and the undercurrent of disrespect toward the civilian consultant was beginning to affect morale and efficiency. Reed had initially been skeptical about bringing in an outside consultant, but the decision had come from higher up the chain of command. His job was to make it work, not to question the wisdom of his superiors. However, watching his staff openly mock and dismiss Natasha was starting to feel like a challenge to his authority. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Natasha arrived at the base at 0600, signed in with security, and made her way to the training facilities. She developed a routine over the past 6 weeks: arrive early, review the day's training schedule, observe the morning exercises, and take notes for her eventual report. She found her usual spot on the sidelines of the main training area, clipboard in hand, watching as the instructors put a new group of recruits through their paces. The exercises were standard Navy physical training: push-ups, sit-ups, running, basic obstacle courses. Nothing particularly challenging by military standards, but enough to separate those who were serious about their service from those who weren't. Grant was leading the session, her voice carrying across the training yard as she corrected form and encouraged effort. She was good at her job, Natasha had to admit. Grant knew how to motivate recruits and maintain discipline. Her only problem was her attitude toward anyone she perceived as a threat to her position. As the morning progressed, Natasha noticed several areas where the training could be improved. The obstacle course layout was inefficient, creating bottlenecks that wasted time. The cool-down routine was too brief, increasing the risk of injury. The progression from basic to advanced exercises was too rapid for some recruits to safely follow. She made notes on her clipboard, planning to include these observations in her weekly report. It was the same process she'd been following for weeks: observe, analyze, recommend. Whether anyone would actually implement her suggestions remained to be seen. What Natasha didn't notice was Captain Reed approaching from behind, his expression growing darker with each step. He'd been watching the training session from his office window, and something about the scene below had triggered his growing frustration with the entire situation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths nobody was prepared to face. Captain Reed's footsteps echoed across the training yard as he approached Natasha's observation position. His jaw was set in a hard line, and several nearby instructors instinctively straightened their postures when they noticed his approach. Reed had been stewing over the situation for weeks, watching what he perceived as a breakdown in military discipline and respect. "Brooks," he called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority that made recruits snap to attention. Word. Natasha turned from her clipboard, meeting Reed's gaze with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout her time at Norfolk. Yes, sir, she replied, though as a civilian contractor, she wasn't technically required to use military courtesies. Reed stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, with the kind of imposing presence that had served him well throughout his military career. I've been watching you for weeks now, he began, his voice low but intense. Taking notes, making observations, acting like you understand what's going on here. Around them, the training session continued, but Natasha could sense that attention was beginning to shift in their direction. Sergeant Grant had noticed the captain's presence and was stealing glances while continuing to bark orders at the recruits. Other instructors were finding excuses to move closer to the conversation. I'm here to evaluate and improve the training programs as outlined in my contract, Natasha replied evenly. That requires observation and analysis. Reed's expression darkened. Your contract, he repeated, the words dripping with disdain. A piece of paper that says you're qualified to judge how we train America's sailors. Tell me, Brooks, what exactly makes you think you understand military training? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Natasha had faced this moment countless times over the past 6 weeks, the point where someone demanded she justify her presence, her expertise, her right to be there. Each time, she'd responded with patience and professionalism, letting her credentials speak for themselves. I have advanced degrees in exercise physiology and military science, she began, reciting the same qualifications she'd presented dozens of times. I've worked with multiple military installations to improve their physical training programs, and my recommendations have consistently resulted in improved performance metrics and reduced injury rates. Degrees, Reed scoffed, his voice rising. Enough that nearby personnel could hear clearly. Academic credentials. Tell me about your service record, Brooks. How many years did you serve? What was your MOS? Where did you deploy? Natasha's expression remained neutral, but inside, she felt the familiar weight of her classified past pressing against her chest. The truth was that she'd served with distinction in ways that Reed couldn't imagine, in places that didn't exist. On any official maps, completing missions that would never appear in any public record. But that truth was locked away behind security classifications that would take Pentagon-level authorization to reveal. My background is outlined in my personnel file, she said carefully. I'm here as a civilian contractor to provide expertise in physical training optimization. By now, the confrontation had drawn the attention of most of the training staff. Grant had turned the recruits over to another instructor and was walking over with obvious interest. Walsh appeared from around the equipment shed, drawn by the raised voices. Lieutenant Palmer stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to leave. Your personnel file, Reed repeated, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. A sanitized document that tells us nothing about your actual qualifications. For all we know, you're some politician's daughter who needed a job or a defense contractor's wife looking for something to keep busy. The insult landed exactly as Reed intended. Around the group, Natasha could see nods of agreement, suppressed smiles, and the kind of satisfied expressions that people wear when their prejudices are confirmed by authority figures. Grant stepped forward, emboldened by Reed's public challenge. Captain, if I may, she interjected, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who knows she's on the winning side. The men and women under my command have been asking the same questions. They're wondering why they should take instruction from someone who's never worn the uniform, never faced enemy fire, never understood what it means to serve. Exactly, Walsh chimed in, crossing his arms over his chest. We've got decorated veterans here, people who've actually served their country, and we're supposed to listen to fitness advice from someone who probably learned everything she knows in a college classroom. Natasha stood quietly in the center of the growing circle, her clipboard hanging at her side. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, measuring her, finding her lacking. The morning sun was growing hotter, and sweat was beginning to form on her forehead, but her hands remained steady. Lieutenant Palmer, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should give her a chance to explain her background," she suggested weakly, though her tone suggested she didn't expect much. "Oh, I think we've heard enough explanations," Grant replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Academic degrees, consulting experience, performance metrics. But what about real experience? What about the kind of knowledge that comes from actually living the military life?" Reed nodded approvingly at Grant's comments. "Sergeant Grant raises an excellent point. This is the United States Navy, not a university fitness program. Our training has to prepare sailors for real-world challenges, life-and-death situations, where academic theory won't save them." The crowd around them continued to grow as word spread that something significant was happening on the training field. Recruits had stopped their exercises entirely, sensing that their instructor's attention was focused elsewhere. The atmosphere was charged with the kind of energy that builds before a storm. Natasha had faced hostile interrogations before, but those had been conducted by enemy forces who saw her as a threat to be eliminated. This was different. This was rejection by people who should have been allies, dismissal by those who were supposed to be on the same side. The psychological pressure was different, more personal, more cutting. "I understand your concerns," she said finally, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "My role here is to provide recommendations based on proven scientific principles and best practices from other military installations. I'm not here to replace your experience or dismiss your expertise." "Proven scientific principles," Walsh repeated mockingly. "Best practices from other installations. Lady, this isn't a laboratory experiment. This is military training. These recruits need to be prepared for combat, not optimized for some academic study." The laughter that followed Walsh's comment was cruel and pointed. Natasha could see the satisfaction on the faces around her, the pleasure they took in her discomfort. She'd become the target for every frustration, every resentment, every insecurity that existed within the command structure. But what none of them could see was the calculation happening behind her calm exterior. Natasha was assessing threats, identifying exit routes, cataloging potential weapons and allies. It was an automatic response, trained into her through years of dangerous operations where situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. The confrontation was escalating beyond mere professional disagreement. It was becoming personal, vindictive, and potentially dangerous to her ability to complete her mission at Norfolk. Decisions would have to be made soon about how much of herself she was willing to reveal to defuse the situation. Captain Reed was preparing to make those decisions for her. The morning heat was becoming oppressive, but the temperature on the training field had nothing to do with the Virginia sun. Captain Reed stepped closer to Natasha, his shadow falling across her clipboard as he towered over her smaller frame. The crowd that had gathered was no longer pretending to focus on other tasks. This had become the main event of the day. "You know what I think, Brooks?" Reed said, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had made up his mind and wasn't interested in discussion. "I think you're exactly what's wrong with modern military contracting. Bureaucrats and academics who've never served a day in their lives telling real warriors how to do their jobs." Staff Sergeant Alex Rivera had joined the growing circle, drawn by the commotion. Rivera was a quiet man with 20 years of service under his belt, most of it in active duty assignments that had taken him through multiple combat deployments. Unlike some of the others, he didn't seem to be enjoying the public confrontation, but he wasn't leaving either. "Captain," Rivera said carefully, Perhaps we should take this conversation somewhere more private? Reed turned his attention to Rivera with obvious irritation. Private? Why should this be private, Staff Sergeant? Brooks here has been walking around our base for 6 weeks, taking notes on how we do our jobs, preparing reports that will probably criticize our methods. I think it's time she explained herself publicly. Sergeant Grant stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to solidify her position with the captain. Sir, if I may add something, she said, her voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who knew how to work within the military hierarchy. The enlisted personnel have been talking about this situation for weeks. Morale is being affected. How so, Sergeant? Reed asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Well, sir, it's difficult for the sailors to respect training guidance when they know it's coming from someone who's never been where they're going. These young people are preparing for deployments, for situations where their lives might depend on their physical conditioning. They need to trust that their training is coming from people who understand what they'll face. Grant's words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable and professional, but Natasha could hear the underlying message clearly. The sergeant was positioning herself as the voice of the enlisted personnel, claiming to speak for soldiers who weren't present to speak for themselves. Corporal Walsh nodded vigorously in agreement. Exactly, sir. I mean, no disrespect to civilian expertise, but there's a difference between knowing something in theory and knowing it because you've lived it. When you're in a combat zone and your buddy's life depends on whether you can carry him to safety, you don't want to find out that your training was designed by someone who's never carried a wounded soldier. The imagery Walsh painted was vivid and emotional, designed to resonate with anyone who had served in dangerous situations. It was also completely irrelevant to Natasha's actual role at Norfolk, which focused on optimizing basic physical fitness, training for new recruits, not combat tactics. But the logical disconnect didn't seem to matter to the crowd. Lieutenant Palmer shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between her desire to fit in with the more experienced personnel and her growing unease with the direction of the confrontation. Maybe we could review her specific recommendations, she suggested weakly. See if there are elements that could be useful, even if we have concerns about the source. Her recommendations, Reed repeated, his voice heavy with sarcasm. Let me guess, more stretching, better nutrition, maybe some yoga classes? The kind of fitness advice you'd get from a health magazine? The crowd laughed appreciatively, and Natasha noticed several people pulling out phones to record what was happening. In the age of social media, public humiliations had a way of spreading far beyond their original audience. Whatever happened here would likely be viewed by thousands of people within hours. Colonel James Burke, the base commander, had been watching the situation develop from the window of his office in the administrative building. Burke was a seasoned officer who had seen enough military politics to recognize a potentially career-ending situation when he saw one. He picked up his phone and made a call to the Pentagon, requesting immediate clarification on the background and authority of one Natasha Brooks, civilian contractor. The response he received made him set down the phone with a very worried expression. Back on the training field, the confrontation was reaching a new level of intensity. Walsh had moved closer to Natasha, using his size advantage to create an intimidating presence. You know what really bothers me? He said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. It's the arrogance. Walking around here like you belong. Like you have something to teach people who've dedicated their lives to military service. I've never claimed to know more than experienced personnel, Natasha replied calmly. My role is to provide data-driven recommendations based on scientific research and best practices from other installations. Data-driven recommendations. Grant repeated mockingly. Scientific research. You sound like a PowerPoint presentation. This is the real world, Brooks. This is where theory meets reality, and reality has a way of exposing people who don't belong. The personal attacks were becoming more pointed, more cruel. Natasha could see the pleasure that Grant and Walsh were taking in her discomfort. Natasha could see the pleasure that Grant and Walsh were taking in her discomfort. The way they fed off each other's energy and the approval of the crowd. It was a familiar dynamic pack behavior, where individuals felt empowered to act more aggressively because they had the support of a group. Captain Reed checked his watch, seeming to make a decision. You know what, Brooks? I think it's time for a practical demonstration. If you're going to evaluate our training methods, maybe you should show us what you can do. The suggestion sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. This was what they had been building toward. A chance to publicly demonstrate that the civilian contractor couldn't meet the standards she was supposed to be evaluating. "Sir, I'm not sure that's appropriate," Staff Sergeant Rivera said, his discomfort with the situation becoming more apparent. "Miss Brooks is here in a consulting capacity, not as a participant in training exercises." "Appropriate?" Reed's voice rose sharply. "What's not appropriate is having someone evaluate our programs who can't demonstrate basic military fitness herself. If Brooks wants to criticize our methods, she should be able to show us a better way." Natasha looked around the circle of faces surrounding her. She could see the anticipation, the eagerness for her to fail, the satisfaction they would take in proving their point. She had faced similar moments before, though in very different circumstances. The choice was the same now as it had been then. Reveal enough to survive, or maintain her cover and accept the consequences. "What kind of demonstration did you have in mind, Captain?" she asked quietly. Reed smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Oh, I think we can start simple. Let's see if you can complete the basic obstacle course that our new recruits run every day. If you can't meet the minimum standards that we expect from 18-year-old sailors, then maybe you'll understand why we question your qualifications to evaluate our training." The challenge was issued publicly in front of dozens of witnesses, with phones recording every word. There was no graceful way to decline without appearing to validate every criticism that had been leveled against her. Natasha realized that Captain Reed had maneuvered her into a position where she would have to reveal at least some of her capabilities. What he didn't understand was that he had also maneuvered himself into a position where he was about to discover that his assumptions about civilian contractors were dangerously inaccurate. The obstacle course stretched across 50 yards of sand and concrete, featuring walls to climb, ropes to traverse, barriers to leap, and crawls to navigate. It was designed to test the basic physical capabilities required for military service strength, endurance, coordination, and mental toughness. For Natasha, who had completed courses that made this one look like a children's playground, it represented an interesting tactical problem. How much should she reveal? How much was enough to defend her position without exposing the full extent of her capabilities? As she walked toward the starting line, she made her decision. She would complete the course, but she would do it in a way that suggested good fitness and preparation rather than elite military training. She would win this battle while keeping her true identity concealed. What she didn't know was that concealment was no longer an option. Natasha stood at the starting line of the obstacle course, her hands hanging loosely at her sides as she surveyed the challenges ahead. The crowd had swelled to include nearly everyone on the training field: instructors, recruits, administrative personnel, and even some maintenance workers who had wandered over to see what the commotion was about. Word was spreading through the base like wildfire. The civilian contractor was about to be put in her place. Captain Reed positioned himself where he could observe every aspect of Natasha's performance. He pulled out a stopwatch, making a show of preparing to time her run. "The minimum standard for new recruits is 8 minutes, he announced loudly. "Let's see how our fitness expert performs against the baseline we expect from teenagers fresh out of high school." Sergeant Grant stood near the finish line, her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face. She had positioned herself to get the best view of what she expected to be an embarrassing failure. "Take your time, Brooks. she called out with false encouragement. There's no shame in admitting when something is beyond your capabilities. Corporal Walsh had climbed onto a nearby equipment crate to get a better vantage point. He was already composing the social media posts in his head, imagining the satisfaction of sharing video footage of the arrogant civilian contractor failing to complete a basic military exercise. His phone was recording, and he could see at least a dozen other devices pointed in Natasha's direction. Staff Sergeant Rivera remained uncomfortable with the entire situation, but he had taken a position where he could act as an unofficial safety observer. Despite his concerns about the appropriateness of the challenge, he was professionally obligated to ensure that no one got hurt during what was rapidly becoming a spectacle. Lieutenant Palmer stood with a group of junior officers, her expression conflicted. Part of her wanted to see Natasha succeed, if only to prove that the harassment had been unfair. But another part of her wanted to fit in with her colleagues, and that meant hoping for a failure that would validate the group's judgment. The obstacle course itself was a standard military design, a series of physical challenges that tested different aspects of fitness and coordination. It began with a 30-yard sprint to a 6-foot wall that had to be climbed without assistance. After the wall came a rope traverse across a water-filled pit, followed by a series of low crawls under barbed wire. The course then included tire runs, balance beam walks, and concluded with a final sprint to the finish line. For active duty personnel who trained regularly, 8 minutes was a reasonable but achievable standard. For civilians, especially those without recent physical training, it could be a significant challenge. Reed was confident that Natasha would either fail to complete the course entirely or finish well over the time limit, providing clear evidence that she was unqualified to evaluate military training programs. "Whenever you're ready, Brooks," Reed called out, his finger poised over the stopwatch. "Unless you'd prefer to concede that this might be beyond your current fitness level." Natasha looked back at him with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "I'm ready, Captain," she said quietly. Reed pressed the stopwatch. "Go." Natasha began running toward the first obstacle, her pace steady but not exceptional. To the casual observer, she looked like someone who was in decent shape, but not particularly athletic. Her form was good, her breathing controlled, but there was nothing spectacular about her initial sprint. When she reached the 6-foot wall, she paused for just a moment to assess the best approach. Then she jumped, caught the top edge with both hands, and pulled herself up with a fluid motion that spoke of practiced technique. She swung her leg over the top and dropped to the other side, landing softly on the balls of her feet. "Not bad," Walsh called out from his perch on the equipment crate. "Let's see how she handles the rope traverse." The rope traverse was where many people struggled. It required upper body strength, coordination, and technique to move hand over hand across a 20-foot span without falling into the water below. Natasha approached the rope with the same careful assessment she'd given the wall. She gripped the rope with both hands, tested its tension, and then began moving across. Her progress was steady and efficient, each movement calculated to minimize energy expenditure while maintaining momentum. When she reached the other side, she dropped to the ground without having touched the water. A murmur went through the crowd. This was better than many of them had expected, but it was still within the realm of possibility for someone who maintained decent fitness. The real tests were yet to come. The low crawl section was designed to be particularly challenging for people who weren't accustomed to military-style exercises. Participants had to crawl on their bellies under strands of barbed wire for 30 yards, maintaining a low profile while moving as quickly as possible through sand and dirt. Natasha dropped to her stomach and began crawling with a technique that surprised the observers. Instead of the awkward struggling that most civilians demonstrated, she moved with a smooth, almost serpentine motion that kept her body low while allowing for rapid forward progress. Her clothing became dirty, but she showed no signs of discomfort or hesitation. Where did she learn to move like that? Palmer asked quietly. Lucky technique, Grant replied, though her voice carried less confidence than before. Anyone can look. Good for a few minutes. The tire run section required participants to step through a series of tires laid out in a complex pattern, testing agility and foot speed. Natasha navigated the course with precise footwork, never missing a step or losing. Her movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no energy on unnecessary motions. Colonel Burke had arrived at the training field, having received some very interesting information from his Pentagon contact. He positioned himself where he could observe both Natasha's performance and the reactions of his personnel. What he was seeing confirmed his growing suspicions about the true identity of their civilian contractor. As Natasha approached the balance beam section, Captain Reed checked his stopwatch and felt the first stirrings of concern. She was moving faster than he had anticipated, and her technique was far more polished than any civilian contractor should possess. The confidence in her movements suggested someone who had completed similar courses many times before. The balance beam was 12 feet long and only 4 inches wide, suspended 3 feet above the ground. It was designed to test both physical balance and mental composure under pressure. Most people approached it cautiously, moving slowly to avoid falling. Natasha stepped onto the beam and walked across it at nearly normal walking speed, her arms extended slightly for balance, but her posture confident and relaxed. She reached the other side without hesitation and jumped down to continue toward the final sprint. The crowd had grown quieter as Natasha's performance exceeded their expectations. This wasn't the embarrassing failure they had anticipated. Whatever else she might be, the civilian contractor was clearly in excellent physical condition and possessed training that went beyond casual fitness. 5 minutes 30 seconds, Reed called out as Natasha crossed the finish line. She had not only completed the course, but had done so well under the minimum time requirement, faster than many of the active duty personnel present could manage. Natasha stood at the finish line, barely breathing hard, her clothes dirty, but her composure intact. She looked back at Captain Reed and the assembled crowd with the same calm professionalism she had shown at the beginning of the morning. Acceptable? She asked quietly. The silence that followed her question was heavy with implications. This performance couldn't be explained by academic credentials or civilian fitness programs. The techniques she had demonstrated, the efficiency of her movements, the obvious familiarity with military-style obstacles, it all suggested a background that didn't match her official personnel file. Captain Reed stared at the stopwatch in his hand, his earlier confidence evaporating as he tried to reconcile what he had just witnessed with his assumptions about civilian contractors. He had intended to prove that Natasha was unqualified to evaluate military training. Instead, he had created a demonstration that raised entirely new questions about who she really was. Colonel Burke stepped forward, his expression serious. He had information that would change everything. But first, he needed to see how far Captain Reed was willing to push this confrontation. The breaking point was approaching, and everyone present was about to discover that they had made assumptions that could end careers. Captain Reed stared at the stopwatch in his hand, the numbers glowing accusingly. 5:30. It was a time that would have been respectable for an active-duty sailor, impressive for a new recruit, and absolutely impossible for the soft civilian contractor he had expected to humiliate. The silence around the training field was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the Norfolk harbor. The crowd that had gathered to witness Natasha's failure was now experiencing a collective cognitive dissonance. What they had just seen didn't match their preconceptions, their assumptions, or their carefully constructed narrative about the unqualified civilian in their midst. Phones that had been recording in anticipation of an embarrassing failure were still rolling, but now they were capturing something entirely different. Sergeant Grant was the first to break the uncomfortable silence. "Lucky run," she said though. Her voice lacked the conviction of her earlier taunts. "Anyone can get lucky once. Muscle memory from high school athletics, maybe." Corporal Walsh climbed down from his equipment crate, his expression troubled. The woman he had dismissed as a college-educated desk jockey had just outperformed half the active-duty personnel on the base. His social media post was going to need some serious revision. "That was unexpected," Lieutenant Palmer admitted quietly to the officer standing next to her. "I've seen Marines struggle with that course." Staff Sergeant Rivera approached Natasha with professional interest. "Ma'am, that was excellent technique on the rope traverse. Where did you learn that particular method?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Natasha looked at Rivera for a moment, recognizing a fellow professional who was asking the right questions. "Various training programs," she replied carefully. "Technique is important for efficiency." Colonel Burke was watching the entire exchange with growing anticipation. The information he had received from the Pentagon was classified at levels that required careful handling, but it was about to become very relevant to the situation unfolding before him. He checked his watch and made a decision to let events play out a little longer. Captain Reed was struggling with a reality that didn't fit his worldview. He had built his entire confrontation on the assumption that Natasha would fail, that her failure would validate his authority and prove his point about civilian contractors. Instead, he was facing evidence that his assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. "One obstacle course doesn't prove anything," Reed said finally, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Physical fitness is just one aspect of military competence. There are other qualities that matter more: leadership, decision-making under pressure, the ability to function as part of a team." "Absolutely correct, Captain," Colonel Burke said, stepping forward for the first time. His voice carried the unmistakable authority of senior command, and conversations around the training field died instantly. "Perhaps we should discuss those qualities." Reed turned toward his commanding officer with obvious surprise. "Sir, I didn't realize you were observing." "I've been observing for quite some time," Burke replied, his expression neutral but his tone suggesting that Reed should be very careful about his next words. "I've also been making some phone calls to clarify exactly who we have working at our base." A chill ran through the assembled crowd. When colonels started making phone calls about personnel issues, careers could change very quickly. The casual atmosphere of public humiliation was rapidly transforming into something much more serious, but Captain Reed was too committed to his course of action to recognize the warning signs. His professional reputation and personal pride were now tied to proving that he had been right about Natasha. The obstacle course performance had shaken his confidence, but it hadn't changed his fundamental belief that civilian contractors didn't belong in military training environments. "With respect, sir," Reed said, his voice taking on the formal tone that military officers use when they're about to make career-limiting decisions, "I believe this situation demonstrates exactly the problems I've been concerned about. We have a civilian contractor whose credentials don't match her apparent capabilities, which raises questions about the accuracy of her personnel file." Burke nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right to be concerned about personnel files that don't match observed capabilities. That's exactly the kind of security issue that requires immediate attention." Reed smiled, interpreting Burke's words as support for his position. "Thank you, sir. I believe the appropriate action would be to conduct a thorough review of Ms. Brooks's background and qualifications before allowing her to continue in her current role." "An excellent suggestion," Burke replied. "In fact, I think the situation warrants immediate action. We need to resolve any questions about credentials and authority right here, right now, in front of everyone who has witnessed today's events." The crowd sensed that something significant was about to happen. The casual mockery and entertainment had transformed into an official command situation with potentially serious consequences. People began positioning themselves to have clear views. While staying out of the way of senior officers, Natasha remained standing near the finish line of the obstacle course, her dirty clothes and calm demeanor creating an almost surreal contrast with the military drama unfolding around her. She had faced moments like this before, though in very different contexts. The choice between revelation and concealment was being taken out of her hands by forces beyond her control. "Miss Brooks," Reed called out, his voice carrying across the training field with official authority. "Given the questions that have been raised about your credentials and the discrepancies we've observed between your personnel file and your demonstrated capabilities, I believe it's appropriate to conduct an immediate verification of your identity and qualifications." The words sounded official and reasonable, but Natasha could hear the underlying hostility and the satisfaction. Reed was taking in what he believed would be her final humiliation. He was preparing to strip away whatever facade he believed she was maintaining. "What exactly are you proposing, Captain?" Burke asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm proposing that Miss Brooks provide complete documentation of her background, including any military service that might explain her performance today. If she cannot provide satisfactory documentation, then I believe she should be removed from this facility immediately." The challenge was issued publicly, with dozens of witnesses and multiple recordings. Reed was demanding that Natasha prove her qualifications or face immediate expulsion from the base. It was the kind of ultimatum that military officers sometimes issued when they were certain they held the stronger position. "And if she refuses to provide this documentation?" Burke asked. Reed's expression hardened. "Then I believe she should be stripped of any credentials that allow her access to this facility. Her contractor badge, her access permissions, any documentation that suggests she has the authority to evaluate military training programs." The crowd stirred uneasily. The phrase "stripped of credentials" had ominous implications in a military context. It suggested disgrace, failure, and professional destruction. Natasha looked around the circle of faces surrounding her. She could see anticipation, curiosity, and in some cases, genuine concern for what was about to happen. The morning had begun with casual mockery and had escalated into an official confrontation that would determine her future at Norfolk Naval Base. "Captain Reed," she said quietly, "are you ordering me to provide classified documentation to unauthorized personnel?" The question stopped Reed cold. The word "classified" changed everything, implying levels of security clearance and government authority that went far beyond civilian contracting. If Natasha's background involved classified information, then Reed's demands could constitute a serious breach of security protocols, but Reed was too committed to back down now. "I'm ordering you to provide proof of your qualifications to evaluate military training, or to surrender your access credentials and leave this facility." Colonel Burke stepped forward, his expression grim. "Captain Reed, you've just issued an ultimatum to someone whose actual credentials you don't understand. Before we proceed further, I think you should know exactly who you're dealing with." The moment of truth had arrived. The carefully maintained fiction that Natasha Brooks was simply a civilian contractor was about to be shattered, and the consequences would reshape everything at Norfolk Naval Base. What happened next would be remembered for years as the day that assumptions met reality, and reality won decisively. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Colonel Burke reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing the distinctive markings of Pentagon correspondence. The red stripes along the edges indicated classified material, and the multiple security stamps suggested information that required the highest levels of clearance to access. "Captain Reed," Burke said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "before you proceed with your ultimatum, I think you should understand exactly what you're demanding." Reed's confidence flickered as he noticed the classified markings on the envelope. Military officers learned early in their careers to be extremely cautious around anything that bore Pentagon security classifications. Careers could end over mishandling classified information, and Reed was beginning to sense that he might be walking into dangerous territory. "Sir, I'm simply requesting verification of credentials," Reed said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "If Ms. Brooks has appropriate clearances, then surely she can provide documentation that explains her background." Burke opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. He read it silently, his expression growing more serious with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Reed with the kind of stare that colonels reserve for officers who are about to receive career-ending news. "Captain, you've just demanded that a former Navy SEAL provide classified documentation to unauthorized personnel," Burke said quietly. "Documentation that details operations so sensitive that their existence is compartmentalized at levels requiring direct Pentagon authorization." The words hit the training field like a physical blow. Navy SEAL, the two words that every military person understood, represented the absolute pinnacle of naval special operations. The crowd that had gathered to witness a civilian contractor's humiliation suddenly realized they had been watching something entirely different. Sergeant Grant's face went pale as the implications sank in. She had spent the morning mocking someone whose military credentials exceeded anything she had achieved in her 15 years of service. The confident sergeant who had led the harassment campaign suddenly looked very small and very vulnerable. Corporal Walsh felt his stomach drop as he remembered every derogatory comment he had made about civilian contractors who didn't understand real military service. His phone was still recording, but now the video captured his own horrified expression as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Lieutenant Palmer stared at Natasha with new eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet woman in dirty civilian clothes with the elite warrior she was learning she actually was. The physical performance on the obstacle course suddenly made perfect sense, as did the calm professionalism Natasha had maintained throughout weeks of harassment. Staff Sergeant Rivera nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The movement techniques, the situational awareness, the way Natasha carried herself, all of it spoke to training that went far beyond civilian fitness programs. He had recognized the signs but hadn't dared to believe what they suggested. Reed stood frozen, his ultimatum hanging in the air like an unexploded bomb. He had demanded that a Navy SEAL prove her qualifications to evaluate basic military training. The absurdity of the situation was beginning to penetrate his consciousness, along with the growing realization that his career might not survive the next few minutes. "Furthermore," Burke continued, consulting the document in his hand, "Lieutenant Commander Brooks, her actual rank, is currently assigned to a classified evaluation mission that requires her to assess training protocols across multiple naval installations. This assignment comes directly from Naval Special Warfare Command, Lieutenant Commander." The rank designation sent another shockwave through the assembled personnel. Natasha wasn't just a former SEAL. She was a SEAL officer whose current rank exceeded that of everyone present, except Colonel Burke himself. Natasha had remained silent throughout Burke's revelations, but now she stepped forward with the bearing of someone who no longer needed to conceal her authority. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her posture straightened, her expression became more focused, and her presence seemed to expand to fill the space around her. "Colonel Burke," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of command authority, "I believe Captain Reed has issued an order regarding my credentials." The formal language sent a chill through the crowd. Military personnel recognized the tone of an officer who was about to invoke regulations and procedures that could destroy careers. Reed had issued an ultimatum to a superior officer, and everyone present understood the implications. "Indeed he has," Burke replied. Captain Reed has ordered you to surrender your access credentials and leave this facility. As your current commanding officer, I'm curious about your response to that order." Natasha reached for the bottom of her polo shirt and began lifting it over her head. The motion was matter-of-fact, professional, as if she were simply following a superior officer's directive. But as the fabric cleared her torso, revealing the sports bra underneath, something else became visible that made the entire crowd take a collective breath. Tattooed across her back, between her shoulder blades, was an intricate design that every military person recognized, but few had ever seen in person. The trident of naval special warfare was rendered in black ink with extraordinary detail. The anchor, eagle, and flintlock pistol that symbolized the three environments where SEALs operated. But this wasn't a typical SEAL tattoo surrounding the trident were 5 small stars arranged in a specific pattern, and beneath it, numbers that designated classified operations. The tattoo was a memorial, a permanent record of missions that officially didn't exist and teammates whose sacrifices could never be publicly acknowledged. Staff Sergeant Rivera recognized the significance immediately. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "is that a Gold Squadron memorial?" Gold Squadron was legendary within special operations circles, a unit that undertook the most dangerous and sensitive missions, often with casualties that were never publicly reported. The tattoo on Natasha's back marked her as a veteran of operations that most military personnel would never know existed. "Among others," Natasha replied, lowering her shirt and turning to face Captain Reed. "Captain, you ordered me to surrender my credentials. As a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, currently on active classified assignment, I'm afraid I cannot comply with that order." The formality of her response carried implications that made Colonel Burke wince. When officers began citing regulations and chain of command in response to unlawful orders, investigations followed. Reed had not only harassed a superior officer, but had done so in front of dozens of witnesses while being recorded on multiple devices. Reed's face had gone ashen as the full scope of his mistake became clear. He had spent the morning publicly humiliating someone whose military credentials exceeded his own, whose current mission gave her authority that superseded his position at Norfolk, and whose service record included operations that he would never be cleared to know about. "Ma'am," Reed said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know ... "You didn't ask," Natasha replied, her tone professional but unforgiving. "You made assumptions based on appearance and acted on those assumptions without gathering intelligence. In a combat situation, that kind of failure would get people killed." The training field had gone completely silent except for the sound of waves in the harbor and the distant hum of aircraft overhead. The entertainment value of the morning's confrontation had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that careers were about to be destroyed and lives permanently altered. Colonel Burke folded the Pentagon document and returned it to its envelope. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the field, "let me introduce Lieutenant Commander Natasha Brooks, Naval Special Warfare, currently assigned to Operation Blue Water, a classified review of training protocols across all East Coast naval installations." The introduction was formal, official, and devastating in its implications. Everyone present had just learned that they had been harassing and undermining an officer conducting the mission that could reshape military training across the entire Navy, but the revelations were far from over. The tattoo on Natasha's back told only part of her story, and the full scope of her background was about to transform everything at Norfolk Naval Base. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the morning air, their rotors beating a rhythm that every military person recognized as incoming VIP transport. Colonel Burke checked his watch and nodded grimly. The timeline was proceeding exactly as he had been told to expect when he made his call to the Pentagon an hour earlier. 2 black helicopters, bearing naval aviation markings, circled the base once before settling onto the designated landing pad near the administrative buildings. Even from a distance, the personnel on the training field could see figures in dress uniforms, disembarking with the purposeful movement of people on urgent official business. Captain Reed watched the helicopters with growing dread. Pentagon level. Responses to personnel issues typically meant that someone's career was about to end, and given the morning's events, he had a very good idea whose career was in jeopardy. His hands were shaking slightly as he tried to process the cascade of disasters that had resulted from his decision to publicly confront a civilian contractor. "Sir," Reed said to Colonel Burke, his voice barely steady, "perhaps we should move this discussion to a more private setting." Burke's expression was implacable. "Captain, you initiated this confrontation in public, with multiple witnesses and recordings. The resolution will be equally public." Sergeant Grant had moved to the back of the crowd, trying to make herself invisible as she contemplated the professional catastrophe she had helped create. Her 15 years of naval service, her spotless record, her plans for advancement, all of it was now in jeopardy, because she had chosen to mock someone whose true identity she had never bothered to investigate. Corporal Walsh was frantically reviewing the video on his phone, realizing that he had recorded himself committing career suicide. Every derogatory comment, every mocking laugh, every moment of harassment was preserved in digital form, ready to be reviewed by investigators and superior officers, who would soon be asking very pointed questions about his conduct. Lieutenant Commander Natasha Brooks stood in the center of the training field with the bearing of an officer who had faced far more dangerous situations than an administrative confrontation. Her clothes were still dirty from the obstacle course, but her presence now commanded respect in a way that her civilian contractor facade never could have. "Lieutenant." Palmer approached Natasha hesitantly, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I want to apologize for my behavior this morning." "I should have—" "Lieutenant," Natasha interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of superior rank. "What you should have done was gather intelligence before forming opinions. Making assumptions without adequate information is a fundamental failure of military judgment." The rebuke was delivered professionally, but carried the weight of formal criticism. Palmer realized that her conduct would likely appear in official reports and performance evaluations, potentially affecting her career trajectory for years to come. Staff Sergeant Rivera had positioned himself at attention, recognizing that he was in the presence of an officer whose combat credentials exceeded those of anyone else on the base. "Ma'am," he said formally, "Staff Sergeant Rivera reporting. I apologize for the conduct of personnel under my observation." Natasha studied Rivera for a moment, noting his professional bearing and obvious discomfort with the morning's events. "Staff Sergeant, you attempted to redirect this situation toward appropriate channels. That will be noted in my report." The distinction between Rivera's conduct and that of the others was significant. Military investigations often focused on who had attempted to prevent problems as much as who had caused them, and Rivera's efforts to defuse the confrontation would likely protect his career while others faced consequences. The group of officials from the helicopters was now walking across the base toward the training field. Even at a distance, their rank insignia were visible stars that indicated flag officer status. When admirals traveled to address personnel issues, the implications were never good for the people being investigated. Colonel Burke received a radio transmission and listened briefly before responding with a simple, "Understood, sir." He turned to address the assembled personnel with the formal tone used for official announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Victoria Cross, Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, will be arriving momentarily to address this situation. All personnel will remain at their current positions and maintain military bearing." Admiral Victoria Cross was a name that carried weight throughout the Naval Special Operations community. A former SEAL herself, she had risen through the ranks during an era when women were just beginning to break barriers in special operations. Her reputation for no-nonsense leadership and absolute intolerance for unprofessional conduct was legendary. Admiral's entourage reached the training field, and the crowd instinctively formed into something resembling military formation as the senior officers approached. Admiral Cross was a tall woman with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. She wore dress blues with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career in some of the most challenging assignments the Navy had to offer. Behind her walked two other flag officers and several personnel whose civilian clothes and official bearing suggested they were from investigative services. The fact that investigators had been brought in immediately indicated that this situation was being treated as a formal incident requiring official review and documentation. Admiral Cross surveyed the scene before her, the dirty obstacle course, the crowd of nervous personnel, and the woman standing in the center wearing civilian clothes, but carrying herself with unmistakable military bearing. Her experienced eyes took in every detail, cataloging information that would inform decisions with far-reaching consequences. "Colonel Burke," Admiral Cross said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of command experience, "I understand we have a situation involving one of my officers." "Yes, ma'am," Burke replied formally. "Lieutenant Commander Brooks has been operating undercover as a civilian contractor for the past 6 weeks as part of Operation Blue Water. This morning's events have compromised that cover." Admiral Cross nodded, having been briefed on the situation during her flight to Norfolk. She had reviewed Natasha's service record, her current mission parameters, and the preliminary reports of the morning's confrontation. What she had learned had prompted her to make the trip personally rather than delegating the response to subordinates. "Lieutenant Commander Brooks," Admiral Cross said, turning her attention to Natasha, "report." Natasha came to attention with the precision of a special operations officer addressing the flag officer. "Ma'am, Operation Blue Water has been proceeding according to mission parameters until this morning, when my cover was compromised by personnel actions that escalated beyond my ability to maintain operational security." The formal language of the report carried implications that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. When special operations officers use terms like personnel actions and compromised operational security, it typically meant that someone had interfered with classified missions in ways that carried serious consequences. "I see," Admiral Cross replied. "And these personnel actions, were they conducted by individuals with appropriate clearances and need-to-know authorization?" "No, ma'am. The actions were initiated by personnel who were not briefed on the operation and who did not have authorization to compromise classified activities." Captain Reed felt his knees weaken as he realized the full scope of his mistake. He hadn't just harassed a superior officer. He had interfered with a classified operation, potentially compromising national security activities that were beyond his clearance level to even know about. Admiral Cross turned her attention to the assembled crowd, her gaze moving systematically across the faces of everyone present. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable tone of an officer who was about to render judgment on conduct that had violated military standards and federal law. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "you have been witness to events that will now be subject to formal investigation. What happens next will depend on your level of involvement and your cooperation with official proceedings." The Admiral's arrival had transformed a local personnel issue into a federal investigation with career-ending implications for everyone involved. Admiral Cross walked slowly through the crowd, her experienced eyes cataloging every face, every expression, every sign of guilt or innocence among the assembled personnel. Her decades of command experience had taught her to read people quickly and accurately, a skill that had served her well in special operations and now proved invaluable in administrative crises. "Captain Reed," she said, stopping directly in front of the man who had initiated the morning's confrontation. I understand you issued orders to Lieutenant Commander Brooks this morning. Please explain the nature of those orders. Reed's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. The confident officer who had dominated the training field an hour earlier was gone, replaced by someone who clearly understood that his career was hanging by a thread. "Ma'am," Reed began, his voice shaking, "I ordered Ms. Brooks, Lieutenant Commander Brooks, to provide documentation of her qualifications or surrender her access credentials and leave the facility." "And what intelligence gathering did you conduct before issuing these orders to a superior officer?" Admiral Cross asked, her tone remaining professionally neutral, despite the devastating implications of her question. Ma'am, I relied on her personnel file, which identified her as a civilian contractor. A personnel file that was deliberately crafted to support a classified operation," Admiral Cross replied. "An operation that you had no authorization to investigate, no clearance to know about, and no authority to interfere with." The crowd watched in fascination and horror as one of the most powerful confrontations in military justice unfolded before them. Reed was being systematically destroyed by someone who understood exactly how to apply regulations and chain of command to devastating effect. One of the civilian investigators stepped forward and handed Admiral Cross a tablet computer. She reviewed the information briefly before looking back at Reed with an expression that made several observers take involuntary steps backward. "Captain Reed, this tablet contains video evidence of your conduct this morning, recorded by multiple personnel on their personal devices. The evidence shows you publicly demanding that a Navy SEAL officer remove her clothing, mocking her military qualifications, and issuing unlawful orders to someone whose actual rank exceeded your authority." Reed's face went completely white as he realized that his own personnel's recordings had created an unassailable evidence trail of his misconduct. What had seemed like a moment of triumph was now documented proof of career-ending violations of military law. "Furthermore," Admiral Cross continued, "you conducted this harassment in front of subordinates, creating a command climate that tolerated disrespect toward superior officers and interference with classified operations." Sergeant Grant felt her stomach drop as she realized that her participation in the harassment would also be scrutinized. Her mocking comments, her encouragement of Reed's confrontation, her public dismissal of Natasha's qualifications, all of it was recorded and would be reviewed by investigators, whose job was to identify everyone who had contributed to the security breach. "Ma'am," Grant said, stepping forward despite her terror, "I take full responsibility for my participation in this morning's events. I should have recognized—" "Sergeant Grant," Admiral Cross interrupted, "you should have conducted yourself according to military standards regardless of what you recognized. The fact that you publicly mocked a superior officer demonstrates a fundamental failure of military bearing." Corporal Walsh was frantically trying to delete the video from his phone, but one of the investigators had already approached him. "Sir," the investigator said politely, "that device contains evidence relevant to a federal investigation. I'll need you to surrender it immediately." Walsh handed over his phone with the dawning realization that his own recording would be used as evidence against him. Every mocking comment, every laugh, every moment of harassment was preserved in high definition, ready to be analyzed by investigators and reviewed by superior officers who would determine his fate. "Lieutenant," Palmer approached Admiral Cross with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am, I participated in this morning's events, and I want to cooperate fully with any investigation." Admiral Cross studied Palmer for a moment. "Lieutenant, what specifically was your participation?" "I failed to intervene when I saw inappropriate conduct occurring. I allowed peer pressure to override my professional judgment, and I made assumptions about Lieutenant Commander Brooks without gathering proper intelligence." The honesty of Palmer's response seemed to register with Admiral Cross. "Lieutenant, failure to intervene is a serious matter, but it's different from actively participating in harassment. Your cooperation will be noted. Staff Sergeant Rivera remained at attention, having already been acknowledged by Natasha for his attempts to defuse the situation. His military bearing and obvious discomfort with the harassment had set him apart from the other participants, potentially saving his career while others faced destruction. Admiral Cross turned her attention back to Natasha, who had remained silent during the systematic dismantling of her harassers' careers. Lieutenant Commander Brooks, please provide a complete briefing on Operation Blue Water and the intelligence you've gathered during your time at this facility. Ma'am, Natasha replied formally. Operation Blue Water is a classified assessment of training protocols, personnel management, and command climate across East Coast naval installations. My mission parameters included identifying systematic problems that could affect operational readiness. She paused, choosing her words carefully. This morning's events have provided significant intelligence regarding command climate, adherence to military standards, and the ability of personnel to function effectively when confronted with situations that challenge their preconceptions. Implication was clear. The harassment hadn't just been a personal attack on Natasha. It had been a test of Norfolk's overall military culture, and the base had failed spectacularly. What are your preliminary findings? Admiral Cross asked. Ma'am, I've identified systematic issues with assumption-based decision-making, inadequate intelligence gathering before taking action, and a command climate that tolerates disrespect toward personnel who don't fit conventional expectations. Natasha's report was devastating in its professional objectivity. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was providing an analytical assessment that would reshape training and personnel policies across the entire naval system. Additionally, she continued, I've observed that physical training protocols at this facility are outdated and potentially dangerous. The obstacle course I completed this morning uses techniques that haven't been updated in over a decade, and the injury rates among trainees suggest systematic problems with program design. Colonel Burke realized that Natasha's mission had always been legitimate, even without the dramatic revelations about her background. Her credentials as a fitness consultant were real, her recommendations were valid, and her presence at Norfolk had been officially authorized at the highest levels. Admiral Cross nodded approvingly. Lieutenant Commander, your assessment confirms intelligence we've received from other installations. Operation Blue Water has identified patterns of problems that require immediate correction. She turned to address the assembled crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have witnessed this morning represents a fundamental failure of military professionalism. A decorated Navy SEAL officer was subjected to harassment, mockery, and unlawful orders by personnel who failed to conduct appropriate intelligence gathering before taking action. The Admiral's words carried the weight of official judgment. Careers were ending, lives were changing, and the entire culture of Norfolk Naval Base was about to be transformed by the consequences of a morning's worth of assumptions and prejudices. But the most dramatic consequences were still to come. Admiral Cross reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio containing official documents that bore the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command. The sight of formal paperwork being produced during a confrontation sent a collective chill through the assembled personnel. When Admiral started issuing written orders on the spot, careers died quickly and permanently. Captain Reed, Admiral Cross said, her voice carrying the finality of military justice, you are hereby relieved of duty pending formal investigation for violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, specifically Articles 86, 89, and 134 failure to follow regulations, disrespect toward superior commissioned officers, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Reed swayed on his feet as the formal charges were read. Each article carried the potential for court-martial, dismissal from service, and permanent destruction of his military career. The confident officer who had dominated the training field was now facing the complete collapse of everything he had worked to achieve over 15 years of service. Furthermore, Admiral Cross continued, "You are stripped of command authority at this facility, effective immediately. Colonel Burke will assume direct oversight of all training operations until a replacement can be assigned." One of the investigators stepped forward and handed Reed a formal document. "Sir, you have the right to legal representation. This notification explains your rights and the charges being brought against you." Reed accepted the papers with shaking hands, his eyes unfocused as he tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. In the space of a few hours, he had gone from a position of authority to facing court-martial charges that could result in imprisonment and dishonorable discharge. Admiral Cross turned her attention to Sergeant Grant, whose confident demeanor had completely evaporated as she watched her superior officer's career destroyed in real time. "Sergeant Grant, your conduct this morning violated multiple sections of military law and naval regulations. You publicly mocked a superior officer, encouraged insubordination, and created a hostile environment that interfered with classified operations." Grant's 15 years of distinguished service flashed before her eyes as she realized that her career was about to end in disgrace. "Ma'am, I accept full responsibility for my actions," she said, her voice barely audible. "Responsibility without understanding is meaningless," Admiral Cross replied coldly. "You failed to conduct appropriate intelligence gathering. You acted on assumptions rather than facts, and you influenced subordinates to participate in conduct that violated military standards." The investigator handed Grant her own set of formal charges. "Sergeant, you're being charged under Articles 89 and 134 of the UCMJ. You'll be transferred to administrative duties pending resolution of these charges." Grant's face crumpled as she realized that her plans for promotion, her pension benefits, and her entire future in the Navy were now in jeopardy. The woman who had led the morning's harassment campaign was discovering that actions had consequences, especially when those actions targeted the wrong person. Corporal Walsh was next in line for Admiral Cross's attention. His earlier swagger had been replaced by obvious terror as he watched his superiors face career-ending charges. "Corporal Walsh, you recorded yourself committing multiple violations of military law. Your own video evidence shows you mocking a superior officer and encouraging others to do the same." "Ma'am, I didn't know," Walsh began. "What you didn't know could have been discovered through appropriate channels if you had chosen to investigate rather than assume," Admiral Cross interrupted. "Instead, you chose to create and distribute content that mocked a decorated Navy SEAL officer." The investigator handed Walsh's charges, which included the additional specification that he had used electronic devices to record and potentially distribute evidence of his own misconduct. In the modern military, social media violations carried their own set of severe penalties. "You're facing administrative separation from the Navy with potential for other than honorable discharge," Admiral Cross informed him. "Your conduct reflects a fundamental incompatibility with military values." Walsh felt his knees buckle as he realized that his 8 years of service were ending in disgrace, with consequences that would follow him into civilian life. Employers who saw other than honorable discharge on his record would ask questions he wouldn't want to answer. Lieutenant Palmer approached Admiral Cross with obvious dread, but her earlier honesty about her participation had created a different dynamic. "Lieutenant Palmer," Admiral Cross said, "your failure to intervene was a serious error in judgment, but your immediate acknowledgement of wrongdoing and willingness to cooperate distinguish your conduct from that of others." Palmer felt a small flicker of hope as the Admiral continued. "You'll receive formal counseling and additional training on leadership responsibilities, but you will not face court-martial charges. However, this incident will appear in your service record and will affect your advancement opportunities." The Distinction was significant. Palmer would keep her career, but her advancement would be limited for years to come. It was a consequence that would follow her throughout her remaining time in the Navy, but it wasn't career-ending like the charges facing the others. Staff Sergeant Rivera was acknowledged for his attempts to redirect the situation toward appropriate channels. Staff Sergeant, your conduct this morning demonstrated proper military bearing and judgment. You attempted to prevent the escalation and showed respect for chain of command. This will be noted favorably in your record. Rivera's relief was visible as he realized that his 20 years of service and his approaching retirement were safe. His military experience had served him well in recognizing when a situation was going wrong and trying to stop it. Admiral Cross then turned to address the broader crowd of witnesses. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have observed this morning represents a complete breakdown of military discipline and professionalism. Multiple personnel violated their oaths, their training, and their responsibilities as members of the United States Navy. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. However, this incident also provides an opportunity for institutional learning. The failures you have witnessed will be documented, analyzed, and used to improve training and leadership development across the naval system. The Admiral gestured toward Natasha, who had remained in military bearing throughout the systematic destruction of her harassers' careers. Lieutenant Commander Brooks has conducted herself with the professionalism expected of a special operations officer, even while facing conduct that violated every standard of military behavior. Colonel Burke stepped forward to address the practical implications of the morning's events. All personnel who witnessed today's events will be interviewed by investigators. Your cooperation is mandatory, and any attempts to coordinate stories or destroy evidence will result in additional charges. The investigation was expanding beyond the primary participants to include everyone who had been present. Witnesses would be questioned about their observations, their actions, and their failure to intervene when they saw inappropriate conduct occurring. Furthermore, Burke continued, this facility will undergo a comprehensive review of command climate, training protocols, and personnel management practices. The problems identified this morning suggest systematic issues that require immediate correction. Norfolk Naval Base was about to experience a complete transformation, driven by the consequences of a morning's worth of assumptions and prejudices that had targeted the wrong person in the most spectacular way possible. But Admiral Cross wasn't finished. The most significant consequence of the morning's events was about to reshape not just individual careers, but the entire structure of authority at Norfolk Naval Base. Admiral Cross withdrew another document from her portfolio, this one bearing the distinctive blue border that indicated special orders directly from Naval Operations Command. The crowd watched with fascination as the morning's revelations continued to unfold in ways that no one could have anticipated. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Cross announced, her voice carrying across the training field with unmistakable authority. The events of this morning have demonstrated the need for immediate and comprehensive changes to the leadership structure at this facility. Colonel Burke straightened to attention, recognizing the formal tone that indicated major personnel decisions were about to be announced. In his 30 years of military service, he had seen careers rise and fall, but rarely with the dramatic speed that had characterized this morning's events. Lieutenant Commander Natasha Brooks, Admiral Cross continued, in light of your demonstrated competence, your specialized expertise, and the intelligence you have gathered regarding systematic problems at this installation, you are hereby appointed as Acting Director of Training Operations for Norfolk Naval Base. The announcement hit the assembled personnel like a physical blow. The woman they had mocked and dismissed as an unqualified civilian contractor was being placed in direct authority over the very programs they had claimed she was unfit to evaluate. The irony was so complete, so devastating, that several people actually staggered. Natasha stepped forward, and accepted the official orders with the professional bearing of an officer receiving a combat assignment. "Ma'am, I accept this appointment and will execute my duties to the best of my ability." Furthermore, Admiral Cross added, "You are granted complete authority to restructure training protocols, reassign personnel, and implement whatever changes you deem necessary to bring this facility into compliance with naval standards." The scope of Natasha's new authority was breathtaking. She would now oversee the very people who had spent 6 weeks undermining her, with the power to determine their futures, their assignments, and their continued employment at Norfolk. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been completely overturned. Staff Sergeant Rivera was the first to step forward and formally acknowledge the new command structure. "Ma'am," he said to Natasha, "Staff Sergeant Rivera reporting for duty. How may I assist in the transition?" Rivera's immediate recognition of Natasha's authority set the tone for how the remaining personnel would be expected to respond. His decades of military experience had taught him to adapt quickly to changing command structures, and his earlier attempts to defuse the morning's confrontation had positioned him as someone who could be trusted with continued responsibility. "Staff Sergeant," Natasha replied, "I'll need a complete assessment of current training protocols, injury rates, and performance metrics. We'll be implementing significant changes based on best practices from other installations." The professional exchange between Natasha and Rivera demonstrated exactly what should have been happening all along: competent personnel working together to improve military training effectiveness. The contrast with the morning's harassment and resistance was stark and unmistakable. Lieutenant Palmer approached nervously, clearly uncertain about how her earlier conduct would affect her relationship with the new director. "Ma'am," she said. Carefully, Lieutenant Palmer reporting, "I'm prepared to support the new training initiatives in whatever capacity you deem appropriate." Natasha studied Palmer for a moment, recognizing someone who had made mistakes but had shown the capacity for growth and learning. "Lieutenant, you'll be assigned to assist with the protocol review process. Your engineering background will be valuable in analyzing training effectiveness data." Palmer's relief was visible as she realized that her career could survive and potentially even benefit from the dramatic changes occurring at Norfolk. Her earlier honesty about her failures had created an opportunity for redemption that others would not receive. The remaining personnel stood in uncomfortable silence, uncertain about their futures under a command structure that had been completely transformed. Many of them had participated in or witnessed the morning's harassment, and they understood that their continued employment would depend on demonstrating the kind of professional behavior they should have exhibited from the beginning. Admiral Cross addressed the broader implications of Natasha's appointment. "The changes you will see at this facility represent a new approach to military training that emphasizes competence over assumptions, results over appearances, and professional behavior over personal prejudices." She gestured toward the assembled crowd. "Every person present this morning has learned valuable lessons about the dangers of making assumptions without adequate intelligence. Those lessons will be incorporated into leadership training programs across the naval system." Colonel Burke stepped forward to address the practical aspects of the command transition. "All personnel will report to Lieutenant Commander Brooks for reassignment and evaluation. Your continued service at this facility will depend on your ability to demonstrate the kind of professional behavior that should have been evident from the beginning." The message was clear. Everyone would be given a chance to prove that they could work effectively under the new command structure, but their previous conduct would be carefully evaluated as part of that assessment. Natasha began issuing her first orders as acting director. "I want complete files on all current training programs, safety records, and personnel evaluations on my desk by 0800 tomorrow. We'll be conducting a comprehensive review of every aspect of operations at this facility." The efficiency and authority with which she took command demonstrated exactly why Admiral Cross had chosen her for the position. This wasn't revenge or favoritism, it was the recognition of competence and the placement of qualified leadership in positions where it could be most effective. Additionally, Natasha continued, all training will be suspended until we can ensure that current protocols meet safety and effectiveness standards. We'll be implementing new programs based on proven methodologies rather than tradition or assumption. The scope of changes she was implementing would transform Norfolk from a facility where prejudice and assumption had driven decision-making into one where data and competence determined policy. It was exactly the kind of transformation that Operation Blue Water had been designed to identify and promote. One of the investigators approached Admiral Cross with a preliminary report on the morning's events. After reviewing the document, she nodded approvingly and turned to address the crowd one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, the investigation into this morning's events will continue, but the immediate priority is ensuring that this facility operates according to naval standards. Lieutenant Commander Brooks has the full authority of Naval Special Warfare Command to implement whatever changes are necessary. The transformation of Norfolk Naval Base was beginning immediately, driven by someone who had been dismissed as unqualified, but who now held complete authority over the very people who had underestimated her. The quiet observer had become the architect of a new order, and the changes she would implement would reshape everything about how the base operated. 6 months after the morning that became known throughout the Navy as the Norfolk Incident, the transformation of the base was complete and unmistakable. Visitors arriving at Norfolk Naval Base now encountered a facility that operated with a level of efficiency and professionalism that had become the gold standard for military training installations across the East Coast. Lieutenant Commander Natasha Brooks stood in her office in the administrative building, reviewing performance reports that told a story of remarkable transformation. The numbers were impressive. Training injuries down by 60%, graduation rates up by 40%, and performance scores that consistently exceeded those of comparable facilities. But the statistics only captured part of the story. The real transformation had been cultural. The assumption-based decision-making that had characterized Norfolk's previous operations had been replaced by data-driven analysis and evidence-based planning. Personnel were evaluated on their competence and results rather than their ability to fit preconceived notions of what military professionals should look like. Staff Sergeant Rivera had been promoted to Chief Training Coordinator, a recognition of his professionalism during the morning's crisis and his subsequent excellence in implementing the new protocols. His office was down the hall from Natasha's, and their working relationship had become a model for how experienced personnel could adapt to new methodologies while maintaining respect for proven military principles. "Ma'am," Rivera said, entering Natasha's office with the morning's training reports, "the new obstacle course design is showing excellent results. Completion times are down, but more importantly, we haven't had a single injury in the past month." The obstacle course that had been the site of Natasha's public challenge had been completely redesigned using principles derived from her special operations background. The new design was more challenging than the original, but it incorporated safety features and progression techniques that reduced injury risk while improving training effectiveness. "Excellent," Natasha replied, reviewing the data Rivera had provided. "How are the instructors adapting to the new teaching methodologies?" "Better than expected," Rivera admitted. "There was initial resistance from some of the older staff, but the results speak for themselves. When instructors see recruits performing better and getting hurt less, they become believers pretty quickly." The instructional staff at Norfolk had undergone comprehensive retraining in techniques that emphasized individual assessment rather than one-size-fits-all approaches. Instructors learned to identify each recruit's strengths and weaknesses, then tailor training programs to maximize individual potential while maintaining unit cohesion. Lieutenant Palmer had emerged as one of the most effective advocates for the had emerged as one of the most effective advocates. New training methods. Her engineering background, combined with her experience of the morning's events, had given her unique insights into both the technical and human aspects of effective training design. "Ma'am," Palmer said, joining the morning briefing, "the retention rates for recruits who complete our program are significantly higher than the naval average. Exit interviews suggest that they feel better prepared for their assignments and more confident in their abilities." Palmer's redemption had been complete and inspiring. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and learn from them had transformed her from a follower of prejudice into a leader of positive change. Her advancement in the new system demonstrated that competence and character could overcome past errors in judgment. The changes at Norfolk had attracted attention throughout the naval hierarchy. Admiral Cross visited monthly to review progress and gather data that could be applied to other installations. The base had become a testing ground for innovative training methods that were being evaluated for fleet-wide implementation. "The most significant change," Natasha told Admiral Cross during one of these visits, "isn't in the specific techniques we're using. It's in the mindset. We've created a culture where competence is recognized regardless of how it's packaged, and where continuous improvement is valued over adherence to tradition." The investigation into the morning's events had concluded with outcomes that sent shockwaves throughout the naval personnel system. Captain Reed had been court-martialed and dismissed from service, his career ending in disgrace after 15 years of what had appeared to be distinguished service. His case became a cautionary tale taught in leadership schools about the dangers of assumption-based decision-making. Sergeant Grant had accepted a plea agreement that allowed her to retire early rather than face court-martial, but her retirement benefits were reduced and her service record permanently reflected her conduct. She had found civilian employment, but the incident followed her as a reminder that military bearing and professionalism were not optional qualities. Corporal Walsh had been separated from the Navy with an other than honorable discharge, a designation that created permanent obstacles to employment and benefits. His story became a powerful example of how social media misconduct could destroy military careers, and his case was studied in digital ethics courses throughout the military education system. The broader impact of the Norfolk incident extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The Navy had implemented new protocols for evaluating civilian contractors, new training programs for preventing harassment and discrimination, and new oversight mechanisms to ensure that classified operations were protected from interference by unauthorized personnel. Admiral Cross had used the incident to promote service-wide changes in how military personnel were trained to recognize and respect competence in all its forms. "The Norfolk incident," she wrote in her official report, "demonstrated that our greatest security vulnerabilities often come not from external threats, but from our own assumptions and prejudices." The training protocols that Natasha had developed at Norfolk were being implemented at bases across the country. Her methodologies, which combined special operations techniques with scientific training principles, were proving effective for personnel at all levels of military service. But perhaps the most important change was in the story that was told about the morning's events. Rather than being remembered as an embarrassing failure of military discipline, the Norfolk incident became a powerful example of how individuals could overcome prejudice and assumption through demonstrated competence and professional excellence. Recruits arriving at Norfolk heard this story during their orientation, not as a cautionary tale about respecting authority, but as an inspiring example of how merit and character could triumph over prejudice and assumption. The woman who had been mocked for not looking like a soldier had become a symbol of what military professionalism should aspire to achieve. Natasha's office displayed the commendations and recognition she had received for transforming Norfolk. But the decoration she valued most was a simple photograph of her Gold Squadron teammates. Their sacrifice had given meaning to her survival, and their memory continued to inspire the work she did to ensure that other service members received the training they needed to come home safely. The quiet observer had become a force for institutional change, and the lessons learned at Norfolk were reshaping military culture throughout the naval system. 2 years after the morning that changed everything, Natasha Brooks stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. The audience consisted of senior military officers, Pentagon officials, and representatives from allied nations who had come to learn about the revolutionary training methods that had emerged from what was now known as the Norfolk Transformation. The woman who had once been dismissed as an unqualified civilian contractor was now recognized as one of the foremost experts in military training optimization. Her methodologies were being implemented not just across the U.S. Navy, but throughout NATO forces and allied military organizations worldwide. The most important lesson we learned at Norfolk, Natasha told the assembled officers, is that competence often comes in forms we don't expect. Our greatest strength as a military organization lies not in our ability to conform to preconceptions, but in our capacity to recognize and utilize excellence regardless of how it presents itself. In the audience, Admiral Cross nodded approvingly. As the officer who had first recognized the significance of the Norfolk incident, she had become a powerful advocate for the institutional changes that Natasha's work had inspired. The transformation of military culture that had begun with a single morning's confrontation was now reshaping defense policy at the highest levels. The statistics that Natasha presented were undeniable. Military installations that had implemented her training protocols showed consistent improvements in performance, safety, and retention. More importantly, they demonstrated enhanced ability to identify and develop talent from diverse backgrounds, creating more effective and adaptable military units. Traditional military training, Natasha explained, was designed for a different era, when armed forces could afford to exclude potential talent based on superficial characteristics. Modern warfare requires us to identify and develop every source of competence available to us. The audience listened with the attention that military professionals reserve for information that could save lives and win conflicts. Natasha's reputation as a combat veteran gave weight to her words, but her proven results as a training innovator made her recommendations impossible to ignore. Staff Sergeant Rivera, who had been promoted to Master Chief and now served as Natasha's senior advisor, watched from the side of the auditorium with obvious pride. His career had flourished under the new system, and he had become living proof that experience and adaptability could combine to create exceptional military leadership. Lieutenant Palmer, now Lieutenant Commander Palmer and Director of Training, Assessment for Naval Special Warfare Command, was taking notes on Natasha's presentation. Her transformation from someone who had been swayed by peer pressure into a leader of institutional change had become one of the most inspiring aspects of the Norfolk story. The question we must ask ourselves, Natasha continued, is not whether someone looks like our conception of a warrior, but whether they possess the qualities that warfare actually requires: intelligence, adaptability, courage, and the ability to function effectively under pressure. Her words carried particular weight because everyone in the audience knew her background. The quiet woman who had endured public humiliation without breaking had demonstrated exactly the kind of mental toughness that special operations required. Her response to prejudice and hostility had revealed character traits that no traditional evaluation could have measured. The Norfolk training facility had become a pilgrimage site for military professionals seeking to understand how organizational culture could be transformed. Visitors were always shown the obstacle course where Natasha had first demonstrated that appearances could be deceiving, and the training field where a morning's worth of assumptions had collided with reality. The facility now trained not just naval personnel, but officers from all branches of the military and representatives from civilian law enforcement agencies. The methods developed at Norfolk had proven applicable far beyond their original context, demonstrating universal principles about recognizing and developing human potential. Admiral. Cross approached the podium as Natasha concluded her presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Admiral said, "what you have heard today represents more than innovative training methods. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about military effectiveness and organizational excellence. The transformation that had begun with prejudice and assumption had evolved into something much larger, a new understanding of how military organizations could identify, develop, and utilize talent from all sources. The lessons learned at Norfolk were being applied to recruitment, training, promotion, and assignment policies throughout the defense establishment. In her closing remarks, Natasha returned to the personal story that had started everything. The morning I was ordered to strip my uniform in front of hundreds of people, I faced a choice about how much of myself to reveal. What I learned was that truth has a power that assumptions cannot defeat." She paused, looking out at the audience of military leaders who would carry these lessons back to their own commands. "The tattoo on my back represents teammates who didn't come home, and the responsibility I carry to ensure that their sacrifice contributes to something larger than my own survival. The work we do to improve military training honors their memory and protects the lives of those who serve today." The auditorium was completely silent as Natasha concluded her presentation. The story of personal humiliation that had transformed into institutional change resonated with everyone present, reminding them that individual courage could create systemic transformation. As the audience rose in sustained applause, Natasha thought about the morning that had changed everything. The harassment and mockery that had seemed so devastating at the time had become the catalyst for changes that were saving lives and improving military effectiveness around the world. The quiet observer who had been dismissed as weak had proven that true strength often remained hidden until circumstances revealed it. Her story had become a powerful reminder that appearances could be fatally deceiving, and that recognizing competence required looking beyond surface characteristics to identify the qualities that actually mattered. The legacy of the Norfolk incident continued to grow, carried forward by military professionals who understood that their greatest victories would be won not by those who looked the part, but by those who had earned the right to play it through demonstrated excellence and unwavering character. In the end, the woman who had been stripped of her uniform in disgrace had kept her promise to her fallen teammates. Their sacrifice had contributed to something larger, creating a military culture where competence was recognized and valued regardless of how it was packaged. The tattoo that had once revealed hidden strength now symbolized the ongoing transformation of military culture, ensuring that future generations of service members would be judged by their capabilities rather than their appearance, and that excellence would be recognized wherever it was found. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.